So we'll try it again. Hopefully the sound is now working. So here we are. This is the last day of the currently running 3-week retreat. And from my point of view, it's been a wonderful experience. I think from what I can tell, people have had an enlightening time. Interesting, at least. And registrations for anyone on the other side for the next upcoming 3-week retreat will open tomorrow. So that's in April 2018, the 2nd of April to the 22nd of April. So check out the website if anyone is interested in taking part in a retreat yourself. And there's a couple of things today that stand out looking back on the retreat. So the topic of this satsang will be a few bits and pieces. One of the distinctions I'd like to make is the difference between the working mind and the thinking mind. I'd also like to talk about something which is often misunderstood when it comes to our idea of awareness. We're told that everything is ultimately awareness, and so we wonder why it is that, or maybe we imagine that at some point we will have some perspective of life that is more than just this perspective, given that if I come to know myself as awareness, then wouldn't it be true that I will have a perspective of life from a much broader point of view? So we'll talk about why that isn't the case. And also tying in with the distinction between the working mind and the thinking mind, which goes very much hand in hand with the distinction between a biological reaction and a psychological reaction. I'd like to focus on stop. Because when we hear a lot of concepts, which are really just descriptions about how life unfolds, descriptions about how life might unfold for someone in particular, for an individual. So if I talk about the end of suffering, or if I talk about continuous unbroken peace of mind, and say continuous unbroken peace of mind is the end of suffering, it's just a description. The doer belief inside of us that has a wrong interpretation of life, an interpretation of life which doesn't see life as a happening, unfolding moment after moment. Here's that description. Here's the description that enlightenment is continuous unbroken peace of mind regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. And that peace of mind is the absence of suffering, the end of suffering. So the doer hears that description and says, now I need to make that happen. If enlightenment is the end of suffering, I need to stop suffering. And you could, as an exercise, listen to one or several of the talks, and before you start listening to the talks, go in with this description that everything that is said is a description of how life unfolds, a description of dynamics in life, a description of what might happen, not ever a prescription for someone to fulfill. So if you go in with that and you listen to everything that's said, and you notice how quickly or how easily the doer hears it as something I must do, and say, no, actually, let me see how I can listen to everything that is said as just a description. So a description means I can write it on the fridge, or write it on a piece of paper and put it on the fridge, just as something that describes dynamics, not as something I need to achieve. And the descriptions, why are the descriptions given if it's not something for anyone to achieve? The descriptions are given because inevitably life is always delivering new conditioning. And what we are in any particular moment on a biological and a psychological level is based on these two factors, our genes and our up-to-date conditioning. And our up-to-date conditioning is continually being added to and changed by the new conditioning that is delivered in life. So if we really understand what I am in this moment had nothing to do with me. I am a product in this moment. I am a product of these two factors, my genes and my up-to-date conditioning. If we really understand that, we say, there is no one doing anything, but there is just life happening. And as part of life happening, there is the body on a biological and a psychological level functioning according to its makeup. And so these descriptions are given because they act as new conditioning in life. So by the descriptions being delivered and received, and it doesn't require someone to receive them, it doesn't require someone to say, I allow you in description, I allow you in concept. The concept gets received or not received as part of the impersonal cause and effect of life. Just like if a water balloon is thrown on a wall, it bounces off or it bursts one way or the other. And then the wall, if it bursts, gets wet, not because the wall accepts the water, it's just a happening that is impersonal. Or if the balloon bounces off, the wall doesn't get wet. And so the new conditioning is delivered, and it has an effect one way or another. It either sinks in or it doesn't. And if it sinks in, it becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. And then, without anyone doing anything, it inevitably affects the way that we function in life. Now, all of the concepts being given here are concepts specifically related to happiness in daily living. So all of the concepts are talking about our psychological functioning, not our biological functioning. The concepts are never interested in improving how we function biologically. How we function biologically is going to affect us on a biological level, which means pleasure or pain. And as you've heard many times, our happiness, what we're truly looking for, is not actually to be found on the level of the flow of life, not to be found on the circumstantial or biological level, but rather it's part of our attitude to life. So our happiness is to be found on the attitudinal level, on our level of the psychological thinking. And so all the concepts here have the potential of affecting our up-to-date conditioning that affect our attitude to life. So the concepts that are put forward will be received or not received by the working mind, and they will affect the beliefs in the thinking mind. The thinking mind is the mind, the part of the mind that includes the conditioning in it that says I am the doer and the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And the concepts are effectively delivering new descriptions about life, descriptions that come from seeing life from a position of happiness, seeing life from a position where life has already brought about change, where it became apparent, the way I was seeing life was incorrect. And so once that change has happened, and life is then seen, and seen more accurately, and when you see something accurately, you can tell, I'm seeing it accurately, and I didn't used to see it accurately. That's one of the hallmarks of coming to see past an error. When you see past an error, it becomes very clear that I used to see things incorrectly. And so when that happens, then life is described from this new perspective, and that description is new conditioning that can change our existing conditioning. Now it changes the conditioning on the level of the thinking mind, where the suffering arises. And the suffering arises because essentially there are a set of ingrained beliefs that see life incorrectly. And the beliefs are based on who I see myself as and how I interpret what happens in life relative to who I see myself as. And who I see myself as, when the false beliefs are in place, is essentially I see myself as this body-mind organism, which is not entirely incorrect. In fact, it's not incorrect at all. The incorrect part is when we see ourselves as this body-mind organism. However, we interpret this body-mind organism to be something independent and separate, and having some entity in and of itself that makes decisions completely unaffected by anything else. So essentially we see ourselves as an autonomous, volitional entity that is making decisions and thinking in each moment, but not thinking as a happening, not decisions as a happening, not biological movements as a happening based on our programming, but rather there is an imagination of some entity that simply doesn't exist. An entity that when we look at closely simply can't exist. There is an imagination of an entity that makes decisions and functions completely independently of the circumstance. This is what is meant by my own personal free will, when we believe that we have complete free will and that we are the entity with free will. And so when we look closely, we find this entity doesn't exist. So if we have an idea of ourselves as being the individual that is in complete control of everything I think and say and do and how I act, then that's a false idea of myself. It's a false self-image. And as a result of that false self-image, we also have an idea about what life means when it turns out a certain way. Based on this idea that I am something that I'm not. And the link between my false self-image and life is that I believe that based on the image I have of myself, that I require life to look a certain way in order for me to be complete. I require life, and the other in particular, to function, to be a certain way, to deliver certain things. And if it does that, then I'm complete. And if it doesn't, then I'm incomplete. And we start off from a standpoint of feeling incomplete, thinking that one day when life is perfect, when I've finally lined everything up perfectly, where my computer system is completely organized, and when the garden has all the plants planted in exactly the right place, and when the kitchen is renovated, and the house is neat and tidy, and the car is clean and polished, and the kids have graduated, and so on and so on. When we think one day, when everything is perfectly in line, then I can be happy. And so that's part of the false self-image. And as a result of this false self-image that feels incomplete, we find ourselves putting forward to life a certain portrayal, thinking that my happiness is dependent on the other seeing me a certain way, and the other reacting to me, delivering to me love. So all of this is the false self-image. or based on beliefs that aren't seeing life clearly. So the descriptions come in. So here is where the descriptions come in. The description comes in and says, hey, what you are on a biological and psychological level is completely dependent in each moment. So what you are in each moment on a biological level is dependent on your genes and your up-to-date conditioning. And how you will function is dependent on who you are biologically and psychologically in that moment, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the specifics of the circumstance you find yourself in. So it'd be a reaction that you don't choose, it just happens. Just like two chemicals that come across each other, they react when they interact. But the interaction is not something they control. They bump into each other, and then a reaction happens, and they don't decide how they're going to react. It happens impersonally. And the reaction is either volatile or it's inert, depending on their individual makeup, their composition, and the circumstance they find themselves in, depending on what other chemical they come in contact with. Completely impersonal. And the human being is very much like that, designed very much more complex, but essentially designed a particular way, and will function, will react to a particular situation. And that's not something we can control. Everything that happens in each moment is a reaction. The words that come out of it, if someone asks me, what's your name? And I say, Roger. That's a reaction from this body-mind organism to the circumstance I find myself in. If my genes and up-to-date conditioning were such that I didn't understand English because I grew up in a non-English speaking country, and someone said to me in English, what's your name? The reaction would be different. The reaction would be one of, and I'd respond in my language, saying in my language, I'm sorry, I can't speak English. Which the other person will respond to, depending on whether they understand my language or not. There will be a reaction. They'll either respond in the language I understand, which they can also speak, or they might realize that we can't communicate. So a couple of days ago, I got a question from someone who watches the teaching, listens to the teaching, reads it. I've seen his name pop up. And he asked this question. He said, I can understand how life is a happening and that I'm not in control of what happens, and that each thing that happens is based on a lot of other factors that happen beforehand. So he's talking about events that happen, and even the body's functioning on a biological level in terms of its actions. And he said, however, when it comes to thoughts, I can't see how that's not my doing. So I can see how a lot of life is not my doing. But when it comes to thoughts, I can't see how this is not my doing. When I read it, I thought, wow, so, if you don't get this point, then really a lot of the follow-on doesn't happen, because if we can't see our thoughts as a happening, then all the things that happen after our thoughts are going to be considered a continuation of my doing. If I believe my thought is my doing, then the action that follows on from my thought seems like it's a continuation of my doing. And the teaching, right from the beginning, goes straight to this point. Now, I understand that this is probably the last thing to be seen, that the thoughts are not our doing. But until that's seen, there's really not much hope for peace of mind setting in. Because our suffering is based on the idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer. And also the accompanying belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so if I see my thoughts, which are continuously there and continuously driving action, if I see them as my doing, I then have to assume that the other thinks and those thoughts are their doing. And so the belief in doership remains heavily intact. As soon as we see that the thoughts are happening according to the story of life or according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance, then the whole doership starts to collapse. Now, I understand why, even after listening to a teaching for a long time, the question arises, I can't see. Please explain to me on what basis my thoughts are not my doing. The question arises because the feeling in each moment is that I am the doer. There is a feeling of free will. And that means that our thoughts feel like I produce them. Now, this is actually not such a bad thing. What the problem is when the belief in doership gets ingrained as a result of that being the feeling, that appearing to be the case. It appears that I am the doer. And so the feeling actually is a gift. The feeling is something I'm very grateful is there, because otherwise I would feel like a slave or a robot, a puppet at the end of the string. And we're not condemned after the realization I'm not the doer. We're not condemned to feeling like I am a puppet at the end of a string. The feeling of free will, as opposed to the belief in personal doership, still remains. The belief in personal doership got put in place because the feeling is there. But the feeling itself is not the problem. It's the belief in personal doership that's the problem. So if we can come to see the dynamics and go beyond the feeling for a while, see the dynamics, become clear on the fact that when I look at the dynamics, I can see I'm not the doer. I'm not the thinker of my thoughts. Thoughts arise and they are produced by the body, but we have to look at how the body is produced, how the body gets to its stage. And if we find that the body is always being shaped and always producing thoughts based on its continuous reshaping, then we start to conclude, oh yes, I do think, the body does think, but I'm not in control of what I think. And then that starts to undermine the belief in personal doership. And yet the feeling of free will can remain. So we get the best of both worlds. I feel like I'm free, and yet I know that what happens in each moment is, in that moment, inevitable. It can change. My behavior can change over time. I can learn from past mistakes, because the past mistakes, the outcomes in that moment form the new conditioning that life is delivering. And so that can affect our up-to-date conditioning, and then we find that we act differently the next day or the next week. But that too is a happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I wasn't in control of, and not my doing. So going back to the thoughts, I can understand why the question arises even after having heard the teaching for a while. It's because we're trying to get the answer from how we feel. And when we feel like, wow, that's my thought. I created it. So here's a description, an explanation that might help awareness, attention, to land and see the dynamics more clearly, see what is really happening. So the explanation is given to the working mind, which is the functional part of the mind. It's the part of the mind that doesn't create suffering. It's the part of the mind that doesn't have the conditioning of doership and attachment to outcomes. It's the part of the mind that simply receives information and functions functionally. Like, for example, the thought, how long before my plane leaves do I need to get to the airport? And how long will it take me to get to the airport? And therefore, what time should I call the taxi? Now, that's not suffering. That thinking is not part of the thinking mind. It's not one of the forms of suffering. And why I'm distinguishing between suffering and non-suffering is because what we're really looking for is happiness for the human being. All of this seeking is seeking for happiness for the human being. And it turns out that happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. And or we can say happiness for the human being is peace of mind, meaning not happiness through circumstance, but happiness through continuous unbroken peace of mind regardless of the circumstance. And when we look at it, we find that the suffering is an attitude to circumstance, and in practical terms, it's guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. Those are the general categories of all the suffering that arises. And so when we look at that suffering, the thought about what time to get to the airport and what time to call the taxi doesn't fit into the category of suffering. It doesn't disturb my peace of mind. I can live life with the thinking that comes from the functional working mind and be happy. What does disturb my happiness is the thinking of the thinking mind compared to the thinking of the working mind. The thinking mind is what produces the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry and expectation, and the attachment to outcomes. So, going back to this pointer that may help us see how thinking is not my doing and a happening. If we look at the brain, and the brain is what produces thoughts from one perspective, when we investigate life, from one perspective, the causal perspective, we see that thoughts are a product of the brain, and the brain is part of the body. And the body, as I was saying, is made up of these two factors, our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, let's look at that more closely. When the body is conceived, there is not much of a body. So when conception happens, there's no body. There's no organs. And in time, the egg and the sperm, which are now become one unit, start to grow. And as they grow, the organs are formed. And when the organs form, which is not something that we control, they start functioning at a certain point. So the heart at a certain point has grown. This growing business is important. That's the genes growing. So clearly we don't control that. And so at a certain point the heart has grown and starts pumping. And at a certain point the brain, which is an organ, has grown. And when the baby is born, the brain is developed, but it doesn't have enough conditioning to think in the conceptual way that we understand or that can eventually happen. And as life is observed, as the inputs of life, the experience of life are received, the brain starts to receive new conditioning, and that becomes part of its ongoing growth. And at some point, the brain is developed enough based on its physical growth plus its conditioning to start producing thoughts. Now, whether those thoughts are accurate or inaccurate is a result of the growth of the organ and the very specific conditioning that has happened moment after moment in life. So we can conclude when we look at it this way, that what outputs come from the brain are not my creation. They're created by an instrument, a biological instrument, a very beautiful and intricate biological instrument. When we look at life, we see that life is a growth, an evolution on many levels. And it's amazing. if we go with the theory of the Big Bang, it started at very basic elements that combined to become more and more complex. The universe and the planets formed, and then at some point these combinations became more and more complex, and eventually life happened. Now, I don't think that this was all accidental. I think this is a much grander story, a creation for all of evolution to unfold exactly the way it unfolds. So I don't think it was an accident that the basic elements bumped into each other the way they did. I think this was all the creation of life. And in that creation of life, there was the creation of life itself, consciousness, that came into existence at some point. And then we see the development, the growth of entities, of the physical entities. Animals become more and more complex, and the evolution of animals means that fingers that are required to get into holes to pull out food for a particular animal tend to evolve. So life is an amazing creative force. And so the brain, when I say it's a biological instrument, doesn't mean I'm taking anything away from it. We're just describing it for what it is. So all that I've put out there is a description. And that description will or will not become part of our up-to-date conditioning. So the description is new conditioning. It will or won't become part of our up-to-date conditioning. And if it does, it might mean that we start thinking differently. And the thought might be, I now see how my thinking is not my doing. So the brain has conditioning in many different forms. Conditioning is not the problem. Not, at least, conditioning in general is not the problem. So much of our daily functioning is dependent on conditioning. Our ability to talk, our ability to walk, to drive a car, to use a knife and fork, to log onto your computer, all of that is based on conditioning. If we wish that all of my conditioning get taken away, we'll make that wish because we've interpreted teachings incorrectly. Or we've taken a teaching that has described all conditioning as problematic, and we've taken it too absolutely. Because a teaching is a methodology, and so even if a teaching puts forward a concept that is not entirely accurate, it does it for a reason. So if a teaching talks about conditioning and says conditioning is the problem, it's because it's referring to a specific type of conditioning, but instead of specifying that it's talking about a specific type of conditioning, it just refers to it as conditioning. And in this teaching, we're saying actually conditioning on a whole is not the problem. If we wished for my conditioning to be removed, we would be unable to function in life. We wouldn't move from that point. We would be a vegetable. What we do appreciate is when life removes specific types of conditioning that I'm calling conditioning contained in the thinking mind, conditioning which flowers into suffering regularly during our day or during our life. And that conditioning is based on the false belief I'm the doer and the other is the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And the new descriptions, the new conditioning is just aiming at that conditioning. It doesn't have any effect on the conditioning that we've received that allows us to use a knife and fork, thankfully. It doesn't have any effect on the conditioning we've received that allows us now to function on the roads. So this stopping is very important, because if I put out all of these descriptions, the tendency can be to misinterpret the descriptions and still somehow, when suffering arises, find ourselves trying to fix it, trying to have the suffering end. And the basic principle here is saying that our suffering, the thing that disturbs our peace of mind, is based on the belief that I am the doer and that I need to make life happen. It doesn't recognize that the body is designed in each moment to function in life without the need of someone there to make it function. It functions automatically. A feeling of hunger arises and the body moves towards the fridge. The doer belief doesn't recognize this dynamic and says, I'm the one that chose to move towards the fridge based on my own free will, unaffected by anything else, not recognizing that a feeling of hunger that wasn't there a moment before arose and completely changed the direction of movement in that moment. Simple recognition of something that has been driving us our whole life and has been overlooked, a simple recognition of this factor can change completely how we see everything that happens through the human being in life. Can you imagine that? Understanding that I choose to go to bed because I feel tired. When the tiredness isn't there, the movement towards going to bed simply doesn't arise. I choose to eat because hunger arises. I choose to go to the toilet because a biological urge arises. So that choice is completely determined by a factor that I wasn't in control of. And similarly, a thought arises because I see something or hear something, taste something, touch something, smell something that's in the environment that I wasn't in control of. And the thought arises as a result of that factor I wasn't in control of. And the thought then drives a movement that a moment before wasn't even contemplated. Isn't it radical to think that seeing a very simple dynamic of life that hasn't been seen before can radically change my attitude towards everything, because the principle is the same for every single thing that happens through this body-mind organism, can radically change my attitude towards everything that happens through this body-mind organism and everything that happens through any other body-mind organism. Because it becomes clearly seen, based on an investigation of our own, that life put the investigation in place by delivering the new conditioning and the interest. And we see, wow, what I thought was my doing is a happening. What I thought was the others doing is a happening. Life, from the beginning of time to the end of time, is a happening, and no one has ever done anything. What I mean is no one as a separate, independent doer. There is no one as a separate, independent doer. There are plenty of people. We can't deny that there is a person here. What is not here is a doer, a separate, independent doer. The fact that I'm not the doer doesn't change the fact that I'm going to have to suffer the consequences of the actions that happen through this body-mind organism. I'll receive rewards from society for those things that happen through me that deliver pleasure to society. And I'll receive punishment or pain from society for those things that happen through me, not as my doing, but as a happening that deliver pain to society. There's no escaping that. I can exclaim to the world, I'm not the doer. But the world is not going to suddenly not react to the outcomes. Where this becomes useful is that on an attitudinal level, internally, I can understand that I will have to suffer the consequences. I will understand that on a biological level, the functioning of the body is either going to be pleasurable or painful. No escaping the flow of life, no escaping the pleasure and pain. But attitudinally, there can be a complete reversal of how I relate to what happens. The reversal is the end of guilt and shame, the end of blame and hatred, and the end of pride and arrogance. And when this is seen clearly, this load of guilt and blame from the past, load of pride from the past, suddenly falls away. Suddenly or gradually. And so stop is a reminder that our suffering is based on the belief that I'm the one making life happen, that I'm the one that controls whether there is suffering or not suffering. And so we hear the pointers, and what can happen without us realizing is that we start resisting suffering and trying to throw our mental understanding at the suffering, thinking that now I have enough knowledge that I can stop suffering with my knowledge. And if we come to see, this is why the distinction between the thinking mind and the working mind is so important. If the working mind truly, truly understands what suffering is, this is why I've said it about 20 times so far. The repetition is not an accident. If the working mind truly comes to understand the different forms of suffering, the different creations of the thinking mind, at some point it will realize that even trying to apply the concepts may very well be the functioning of the thinking mind. So when suffering is present, the idea that it shouldn't be present and that I can get rid of it, the struggle against it, is the struggle of the thinking mind. And when the working mind sees that the thinking that is happening, trying to get rid of the struggle or trying to get rid of the suffering, is more suffering, the working mind might actually conclude, I have to stop. Just stop. One of the forms of suffering is expectation. One of the biggest expectations is that life is pleasure, 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 and that life is peace, 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 peace. The fact is that life is a creation, and in each moment, the destined pleasure or pain will be there, and in each moment, the destined suffering or peace will be there. If it's really deeply understood that this is the case in each moment, life is exactly the way it is, then the struggle for the moment to be different stops. It simply doesn't make sense for the struggle against the moment to happen when it's deeply understood that life is one way. Now, let's be clear that that doesn't mean not doing things on a biological level. So if the doorbell rings, if someone has interpreted what I've just said and says, well, in that case, if life is the way it is in each moment and the doorbell rings, I need to do nothing. I need to sit still and have the moment be as it is, which means me sitting on the couch, let's say the only one in the house, the doorbell rings, and I have to sit here, not struggling with the present moment. That's a misinterpretation. The struggle would be on a different level. So if the doorbell rings, the body understands that means there's someone on the other side of the door, and so it is likely to get up and move towards the door. If it gets up and moves towards the door, that's a biological happening, part of the moment, and so we have to accept each moment, accept that the doorbell has rung, and then accept the biological movement that happens towards the doorbell. So if a water pipe breaks, we recognize in this moment where there was no water on the floor, which is how I like it. A moment before there was no water, then the pipe breaks and now there is water pouring out onto the floor. I accept that in this moment it's destined for there to be pain. The water falling on the floor is not in line with my biological preference. And yet, I will get up quickly and go to the water pipe to try and fix it. If I can't fix it, then I have to accept that I have done what I can. Biologically, the movement has happened. I've done what I can, and the outcome is not in my control. I know that I can try and fix it myself. I know that I can call a plumber. I can do whatever I feel to do, given the circumstance, knowing the outcome is not in my control. The struggle is on an attitudinal level, which means once I call the plumber and he doesn't answer the phone, I start attitudinally struggling with the fact that he hasn't answered the phone. He hasn't answered the phone because it's destined in that moment for the moment to turn out exactly the way it does. If I try to fix the pipe and I don't manage to fix it, and I get angry at the fact and struggle with the fact I can't fix it, then that is the attitudinal struggle. So this morning, Sophie described an insight that she had, which is very much in line with this notion I'm talking about here, the stopping of an ongoing form of suffering that maybe we haven't realized is suffering, a form of suffering that is being supported because somewhere in the system there is the belief that this is actually not struggling, this is not suffering, but this is me applying and seeking and being earnest. Whereas, so one of the important points is to start becoming aware of what suffering feels like. And if we find ourselves engaging in a form of doership that we haven't recognized, if we become familiar with what suffering feels like, then we'll feel that something isn't quite right. We'll feel the suffering, and we can then ask ourselves, what's this suffering? And we'll often find it's a struggle against the primary suffering that might be there in the moment. The primary suffering is there, and then we're trying to get rid of that primary suffering. And if that's happening, we'll start to feel an extra layer of suffering. So if we're familiar with what suffering feels like, the doership that sneaks in the back door will eventually get seen. And once it's seen, that's very powerful. It then is seen by the working mind that the thinking that I'm doing, thinking it's useful, is actually another form of doership, and it needs to stop. So we've used the analogy of someone in quicksand. That if someone is in quicksand, the more that they struggle, the deeper they sink. And if it's not clear to them, if it hasn't been deeply ingrained into them, that struggling when you're in quicksand makes you sink deeper, makes you sink quicker. If it's not clear, then intuitively, what happens is we feel like struggling. We think that struggling is good, that struggling is the answer, that if I struggle, if I've fallen into quicksand, that's how I'm going to get out. And so until that really gets recognized, that dynamic is recognized as the problem, not the solution, then the struggling keeps happening and we end up sinking deeper and deeper. But once awareness has landed on the fact that certain movements that seem beneficial are actually part of the problem, once awareness has landed on it, then the working mind, which understands this, sees the thinking mind trying to get out of suffering, trying to change the present moment, and it says stop. It doesn't go into a discussion about why it should stop, it just says stop. Just like the person struggling in the quicksand and sinking deeper, when the thought arises, oh, that's right, my struggling makes it worse, stop. Stop means stop. It is sort of like musical chairs for the mind. Like when the mind says stop, then the mind for a second just stops because it realizes that that's the instruction to stop. And in that stop, it can become clear, that's a relief. It might not relieve the primary suffering, but it will relieve the involvement in the primary suffering. So primary suffering is it's always about involvement. So the primary suffering is the involvement in what's happening in the flow of life, like involvement in the pain of the flow of life. Because we believe that that pain is an attack on who I am at my core. And so there is involvement, which means attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain on an attitudinal level. So that is the core of the primary suffering, involvement. And then we have involvement in the involvement, where we are trying to get rid of that suffering. Involvement in the involvement. And when the mind realizes that that involvement in the involvement is more suffering, it just says stop. Stop with the involvement in the involvement. And that isn't anyone's doing. That is the natural arising, a thought that arises out of the working mind, based on the working mind's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And when it's really clearly seen that that extra thinking is not helping but making matters worse, the thought that says stop happens, and the stopping can happen. And then we feel a relief. And what's left might be the primary suffering. So it doesn't necessarily fix the situation completely. It doesn't fix the fact that suffering is happening. But it means that an extra layer of suffering is not there. And so what Sophie pointed out today is that she said she now sees clearly after 3 weeks of having this rammed into us day after day after day. She sees clearly that actually, even though the sense of suffering tells a story that says something is missing, we need to acquire something in order for the situation to be okay. She actually said that what I see is that nothing is missing. but that there is something additional in the moment that is causing the problem. And so the answer is not to acquire anything, but for that which is additional to fall away. Now, the irony is that this thing that is additional creates the sense that something is missing. So it is like having a room that has a big rock in the room, taking up all of the useful space in the room, and yet the belief is that the problem is that there is a big hole in the room, that there is a big hole in the floor, and that I need to fill the hole in with more stuff. And then when the hole is filled in, everything will be okay. And imagine if we try to fill in the hole that doesn't exist. So we bring in more stuff into the room. We bring in truckloads more soil. We're just filling the room up even more. There's no hole. There's nothing missing. And yet the sense is something is missing. When we see clearly that the sense is based on a set of beliefs that fill the system. And so liberation is not the gaining of anything, but actually the falling away, the dissolving. The dissolving of a set of beliefs that habitually flower into this sense of uncomfortableness with oneself and the other. And so if that's what it is, it's worth looking at what are these beliefs. The belief is that this false self-image, where we started the talk, the false self-image that I am the doer, that the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in outcome. So this false self-image keeps us disconnected from what we truly are. So if the dynamics of life are pointed out, if descriptions are given that show us that I am not the doer, and that my happiness, this is the important part, is not to be found in outcomes, that my happiness actually is innate, is intrinsically, fundamentally part of what I am at my core. That the core of the human being is happy. The core of the human being is complete, and it's simply a set of content that stems out of ingrained false beliefs that life has put in place, not our doing, but life putting them in place as part of this evolution of life. It's a set of content that stems from these false beliefs that covers up a connection to that part of us that is complete and happy in each moment. So, in the end, we don't gain anything. Life continually takes away, takes more and more away. Now, to the mind, the beliefs in doership that wants more and more, thinking that it will eventually be happy with more and more, if it hears that this process is a process of losing, that you end up with nothing more at the end of this process than you did before you started. In fact, you end up with a lot less. The mind might think, well, this doesn't sound like a great program to sign up to. Until the mind realizes that its unhappiness, the human unhappiness, is actually the functioning of mind in a particular way. And so, as a continuation, Jean-Luc was saying, he finds it hard for the thinking that's trying to get somewhere to stop. The thinking that wants to understand more, wants to understand the teachings better, they automatically kick in when the suffering is there. And as we discussed, it's because that is assumed to be something helpful. The thinking says, well, if I can work hard, if I can continue functioning, then maybe I will find the solution. And so the notion of stop seems like a very disappointing. It's sort of like if you're in a challenge, a cooking challenge, and the timer gets down to the last 10 seconds and you're rushing to plate the stuff up and you've still got stuff on the stove, and then the thing is stop, time over, time up. And then we look at our plate and we go, what a shame, I only got 75% of the plate out. What a shame, I don't have enough time. So the mind thinks that stopping is like that. It's like, I didn't get to sort this out. So it doesn't. So if it has more time, if it can function, the mind says, I'm not going to stop. I've got more work to do. I've only got 75% of my stuff on the plate, and I have more time. I can keep thinking. I can keep working. So let me do it. I don't have to stop yet. So this voluntary stop to the mind doesn't make sense until it does. If the mind realizes at some point that actually this assessment is wrong, that the mind continuing to work is the suffering, the mind continuing to try and find a solution to suffering is the suffering. And then once that has happened, it becomes clear that stop is beneficial, not negative. And as that starts getting exercised and we start feeling the relief, where it doesn't work so well is if the primary suffering is intense and we stop, and then we find that the experience is uncomfortable, and so it doesn't feel like any release. And so then what happens is the mind says, let me try and fix this. So that's the dynamic that you were explaining. Somewhere a recognition needs to happen that it's destiny for suffering to be there from time to time, sometimes a lot of the time. And in principle, a struggle against what is destined is more suffering. And furthermore, if we look at the destined suffering that is meant to be there from time to time, we find that at its root, that suffering is involvement and doership. So involvement meaning attachment to outcomes from the past. And so what we're experiencing is doership and attachment to outcomes that's in the system arising from the past. And at its core, there is involvement. That's the core of the suffering that arises. And so if the core of the suffering is involvement, there's no way that that suffering is going to eventually weaken if what we keep applying on the outside is more involvement. More involvement means a resistance against the suffering that is there in the present moment. So if we stop, we've stopped becoming involved in the primary suffering that is there. Now, as I described, it might still feel very uncomfortable. And so the automatic movement is, let me fix this. Unless we start seeing, here I go again, becoming involved with what is. And the core of that uncomfortableness is involvement. So it will feel very counterintuitive, but as soon as we find ourselves accepting, meaning understanding that this suffering is here, it is at its core involvement, attachment to outcomes being different. And so as soon as we accept it as part of the moment, there is non-involvement. That means non-doership has come into the system on the outer level. And so if the core problem of involvement is going to be fixed, it makes sense that it's going to be fixed by first non-involvement happening on the outer levels. Non-involvement with the involvement. If there is involvement with the involvement at the very core of the suffering, how's that going to end? Whereas if an opposite force of non-involvement happens on the outer levels, eventually that understanding, that witnessing, that non-involvement will work its way deeper and deeper into the system and uproot the involvement that is at the core of the initial suffering.
I think it's good to define what you mean by involvement, because I can imagine there's involvement in the flow of life, so involvement with a circumstance. Then there's involvement with the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, the involvement with the suffering is actually what's needed. When you surrender into the suffering, you're actually getting involved with it.
Well, okay, so I wouldn't agree. When you surrender to the suffering, it's not involvement, because we'll use the word involvement in a very specific way. So what it is when we surrender to the suffering, it's being with the suffering, we can say. So we'll keep the words and their definitions separate. So I think you're very right. So the ingrained belief of who I am, which has been in place for our whole life, and therefore life has been related to, the circumstances that happened in life have been related to from this place going back a long time, is this false idea: I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, in pleasure, 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 pleasure. The flow of life in each moment is either pleasure or pain. So the flow of life means circumstance. Our happiness turns out not to be happiness because of circumstance. That's where we think our happiness is to be found, which is why we're trying to control life, so that it's pleasure, 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 pleasure. But it turns out our happiness is not to be found on the circumstantial level, but on our attitudinal level, how we relate to the pleasure or pain in life, how we relate to the circumstance. And so with this deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome, our attitude to circumstance is one of being attached to pleasure and having an aversion to pain, on the basis that we believe that my completeness will one day be found when life is pleasure, 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 and feeling like my completeness is attacked when life is pain. And so when life unfolds in such a way that is pleasurable or painful, with this attitude there is automatically involvement in what is happening, meaning we're invested in what is happening because we believe it is has a direct effect on my completeness, my happiness. So with this belief in place, meaning this attitude in place, there is involvement in the flow of life, which is either pleasure or pain. So involvement with circumstance, involvement with the outcomes in life. And that involvement is the primary suffering. So the flow of life is circumstantial and it's either pleasure or pain. The attitude to the flow of life is one where we think that the flow of life needs to be a certain way, and therefore we can say we are involved in what happens, personally feel affected by what happens. That means if the other delivers pain, our attitude is, you have delivered pain to me, which is an attack on who I am. It's circumstantial, and we believe that our happiness is to be found in the circumstance. And furthermore, we see the other as the doer of delivering the pain, and so we say, you hurt me, you attacked who I am by delivering this outcome to me, so I hate you. Instead of having the attitude that life can put in place, instead of the attitude that sees the other as an instrument through which destiny is unfolding, sees myself as an instrument through which destiny is unfolding, and if I find myself in a situation where the other delivers pain, I will see it as part of destiny and not hate the other as a separate independent entity that is hurting me of their own volition, but rather see it as a happening according to the story of life, understanding that the amount of pleasure and pain that I'm destined to receive in each moment has already been decided, is part of the predetermined story of life that I am intrinsically one with. I'm intrinsically part of the predetermined story of life. So that blame and that attachment to outcomes, we could say, is the initial involvement. It's the initial suffering. Once the initial suffering is there, it feels uncomfortable. It's our unhappiness. And the thinking mind assumes that it needs to do something in order to fix that. It assumes that it created this, or the other created it. And therefore, the blame is worthwhile, or it sees the blame as suffering and that it needs to fix the blame. It needs to stop blaming. So if it sees the blame as a problem, if it sees the blame as attitude to life that is not seeing life clearly, and realizes that that is its suffering, then what it could do is start feeling guilty for feeling blame. So the initial involvement is the involvement in the pain that the person delivered. The secondary involvement is the blame towards the person for what they have done. The tertiary involvement is the guilt towards us feeling blame, all of which is based on the belief I am the doer and the other is the doer, and that life is happening according to me as the doer and the other as the doer. Now, as soon as the understanding sinks in deep enough, what will start to happen is that our involvement in the various different forms of involvement starts to fall away. So the understanding might not have penetrated deeply enough for us not to feel attached to pleasure and pain. So we might still resist attitudinally, meaning have an attachment to outcomes. And so when pain is delivered, we'll still suffer according to the fact that the pain is delivered rather than the pleasure that we expected. So that might still happen. We might find ourselves blaming the other as the doer who delivered that pain to me. So that involvement might still happen. But at some level, hopefully, the understanding of non-doership kicks in and the guilt for feeling blame doesn't happen. Which means on that level, there is a witnessing of the attachment to outcome. There is a witness of the blame towards the other as a happening, and no self-condemnation for the fact that the attachment to outcome and the blame is happening. That compared to if the non-doership hasn't sunk in on that level, then there will be a self-condemnation, a guilt for blaming the other. So if we can see that the root of all of the forms of suffering is involvement in the pleasure or pain being different, involvement in from a level of doership. If we see that that is the root of the suffering, then it makes sense that that root starts to get undone or dissolved when non-doership starts being applied, not by us, but according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, on the outer levels, and it works its way in. So that then leads us on to this question that we sometimes, or this description that we sometimes hear, is that this load of doership energy is contained in the system based on events that happened in the past that were interpreted according to our belief in doership and attachment to outcome. And so the load of energy includes these false ideas of life. And we're encouraged to investigate these beliefs and this energy when it arises from time to time. We're encouraged to investigate this because for as long as it is suppressed and turned away from, which is what we've been doing for most of our life because that energy feels uncomfortable. As long as it's suppressed and turned away from, the doership and the story of doership, the story of attachment, meaning when I say the story of hatred towards another for what they have done, the feeling of shame towards ourselves for what we failed to do correctly, let's say, in the past. If we look away from that uncomfortable energy when it arises, then that story of doership and attachment is never seen. And so the suggestion is, look at it, be with it, dive into it. Now, those all sound like verbs. They sound like they're instructions, prescriptions. Look at it, dive into it, be with it. Now, if we start to understand that all of these things happen in life as a happening, so looking happens based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. It doesn't require someone to do the looking. It doesn't require someone to do the diving. Diving in can happen. Being with these energies can happen. And how does that happen? It doesn't happen because we try to dive in. If we try to dive in, we might be diving in because we're actually trying to control the situation. We're saying, if I dive into these energies and see them, then finally they won't be here. And so when we hear this, it makes sense that we're going to initially hear it as a prescription, as something to do. I need to be with these energies. Whereas more accurately, being with the energy means an understanding on some level that the energy, when it comes up, is going to feel uncomfortable, and I don't have a job to do. I don't even have a job of being with the energy. I don't have a job of diving into it. I definitely don't have the job that I've always thought I had of suppressing it, of looking in the other direction. So if I don't have a job, what does this look like when the suffering comes up? The answer is it can look like anything, because what will happen is whatever happens when that energy comes up, at a particular point in time, we might find the energy comes up, it's so uncomfortable that a distraction, a moving away from it, a suppressing it happens. So if that happens, fine, that's what's happening. No prescription of what you should or shouldn't do. If, however, the descriptions that are being given here land in such a way that make us realize, oh, what I normally do is try to dive into the energy because I heard that's what I should do, and I'm diving in, trying to be with it, trying to feel it, and in fact that's another form of pushing it away. It's another form of trying to control it. It's another form of wishing that it wasn't here. And so in fact, being with it is the simple act of doing nothing. And if we don't do anything to try and fix it, to try and push it away, which really means an acceptance that it is part of this moment and it will change when it's destined to change, then that is being with it. that is when it's felt. You don't need to make an effort to feel these things. In fact, if you're not making an effort to not feel these things, if we can make an effort to push this away, we can make an effort to distract ourselves. If you're not making that effort to distract yourself or suppress the energy, then by default, you're feeling it. You don't need to make an effort to feel it. It means allow it to arise and do nothing. When it arises, you feel it. And even this can turn into something I have to do. I have to allow it to arise. And even allowing can become a subtle doing. So to the extent that we get confused and we think, okay, so what am I supposed to do? I really, even allowing is a doing. It comes back to, no, real allowing is not a doing. Real allowing means the understanding in this moment it's destined to be exactly the way it is. I'm destined to function exactly the way I function. And so I'm going to just witness that functioning. Even if that functioning is suppressing, I'm going to witness the suppressing. And that is being with what is.
Wouldn't a helpful verb for that be noticing?
Yes, if we understand that the noticing is a function of awareness that doesn't need to do awareing. So even the noticing, when we think we have to notice, becomes something I have to do. And it's very subtle, as if I allow, if the suffering arises, and I just notice the struggle against the suffering. That's I notice my struggling against the suffering. That's the doership. Now, it's not necessarily going to end in a particular moment unless it's destined to end. So to recognize the struggle is in itself enough. And then in the next moment, the struggling might stop because we realize, this struggling against the primary suffering is not me being with the suffering. If the struggling doesn't stop, then that's okay. We accept that in that moment, the struggling isn't stopping. So as soon as there is a stopping to try and struggle against the struggle, then we are being with what is. We are noticing what is, which is not something that we have to do because it's our natural state of consciousness. So it comes down to us becoming sensitive to feeling, sensitive to the feeling of involvement and doership, and feeling what non-involvement feels like. Understanding that we can have a whole lot of involvement in the system, and then just a layer of non-involvement. That's where it can start, which is a complete surrender to the fact, yes, I'm involved in the pleasure and pain, I'm involved in the involvement, and I'm involved in the involvement in the involvement. There can be that much involvement, and then an allowing all of that involvement to be there, and on that level, there is some peace.
Listening to you this afternoon, and after these 3 weeks, quite like how can qualify them challenging maybe. I just start to understand what celebration is. I was looking for celebration so long time, during so long. And this release, this stop to looking for something, creates so much space, a very available space. And in this simple but very available space, it's like a rebirth in a way. It's like start to feeling life. And today I'm crying, but because I am happy, not because I'm sad. But it's like the beginning of life in a way. It's you become so much available that everything start to touch you, but nothing ecstatic. Yes, but life start to be recognized, going through you, and yes, it's just amazing. So Roger, I really want to thank you, really, from the depths of my heart, because, and I know I hope a lot of people are listening this satsang, and I want to say that it makes a lot of sense to be here 3 weeks and to go through this journey, not always comfortable, but so powerful and beautiful, and really I thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I also don't think that before this I had a good understanding of the framework of a teaching in general, but especially the pent up energies within the body. That was something I kind of thought, and I'm sure I had heard it in other teachings, like, oh, that's nonsense, awakening can happen, you won't even know when it happens, and can come out of the blue, and there is no process, and it's been very, at first, what seemed to be like such unfortunate news about the emotional release began to just make so much sense in terms of the one resisting that release is actually the problem. And I think for me, for a while, in the past, there might have been what was deemed to be an inappropriate release. Let's say, you're with friends and some emotions come up and you have to excuse yourself. And something that started to be seen for me is that my attachment to those outcomes of, if I bust out crying or if I leave, my friends will judge me, I can't, or at work, like, I can't take an hour of PTO to go cry in my car or whatever it might be, is just seen to be less important. It's seen to what really matters is becoming more clear to me personally, and in each moment to do what you feel like doing. That is just such a powerful and amazing pointer. It's incredible what happens with the yielding instead of the trying to force something away, because it it just never works. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing. It's once you mention do what you feel like, it's worth just pointing out why that fits in so much, and why the releasing of energies is not just some sort of therapy, but how that is important relative to the framework. Because without the framework, I think a lot of these things can happen, but without any real depth of seeing, and it becoming part of the new conditioning that reinforces the understanding. So do what you feel like is really pointing us past the long list of shoulds and shouldn'ts that we have in place, that we've learnt either because we've told this is how you're meant to function in life, or because we've concluded it, deducted it based on an assessment of what works best and not. So our long list of shoulds and shouldn'ts is based on the ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, my happiness is to be found in pleasure. Ultimately, my happiness is to be found in love of the other. And so with that deeply ingrained belief, we essentially in each moment function based on what is going to deliver the best outcome. And us only being able to see that outcome as completely relevant to my happiness. So then what happens is that we live in each moment based on what should I do, what is the best strategy to get the most pleasure, because that pleasure is my happiness. So what happens is we forego our true happiness, which is spontaneity. We forego our true happiness, which is a spontaneity that comes from a connection to a deeper part of ourselves. And instead, we exchange it for a strategy of how to live life in order to get what we think will make us happy, in order to get what we think will make us more complete, based on the false belief that what I am is an entity that will one day be fulfilled by things from out there. And so even the lack of freedom to honor your emotions in a certain situation comes from this: what should I do in this moment? Oh, I shouldn't, as you described, I shouldn't do X, Y, and Z, because if I do that, my friends will think this. That's pain in the moment, and therefore I will hold back on doing that because it will deliver pain in the moment. Whereas actually, what it will deliver may not be the pain we think, first of all. And even if it does deliver pain that we think, what we exchange that for is a freedom of acting much more spontaneously, acting much more as the body is directing us to act. And the body has far more intelligence, an intelligence that will lead us, especially if it's accompanied by awareness, will lead us towards the happiness we're looking for, compared to the lack of intelligence in the thinking mind that is forming a strategy based on a false premise. The thinking mind and all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts based on a false premise that what I am is an entity that requires more and more from out there to one day be happy. So you can see that when the thinking mind creates strategy based on a false premise, it's actually all flawed. And if we don't overcome this flaw, meaning if we don't see it and we keep functioning from this place, what happens is the uncomfortableness builds up more and more and more. Eventually, it hits us. This isn't working. This living life from these shoulds and shouldn'ts isn't delivering what I'm looking for. And then we might hear some instruction that says, actually, why don't you march to the beat of a different drum? You're free to do things differently. It's your conditioning that has been taken to be absolute. It's the concepts that have been delivered to you by authority or by society that have told you this is the way you should function, which is actually society trying to find their happiness in getting everyone to deliver them pleasure. So it's the same flaw being perpetuated. And until we step out of that and realize, no, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, and I'm not going to continue to believe it is. I'm not going to continue to believe conditioning from society that tells me it is. And in fact, in this moment, I'm free to do whatever I think or feel to do. In this moment, I'm free to eat when I'm hungry. I'm free to sleep when I'm tired. And even the belief that says, I'm not free to sleep when I'm tired because I have to do X, Y, and Z, that's another belief. You don't. You can go to sleep. You can get in your car and go to sleep. And we're so concerned about what the outcome is, thinking that the outcome is my happiness, that we don't give ourselves the freedom to leave a job that we don't like, to leave a relationship that isn't fulfilling us. So this movement down out of the head into the body, where we start feeling. And to me, that feeling is actually receiving instruction from God. That is my instruction from God as to how to function in the next moment. I'm being lived. Remember the impulse that arises that I didn't control, the hunger, the tiredness, the thoughts, they are not my doing. They are my instruction from God. Now, when I'm running off my shoulds and shouldn'ts, that too is instruction from God, but it's instruction from God that drives us down a path of lack of self-knowledge and down a path of feeling uncomfortable with life. And at some point we realize, oh, there's another instruction that I get from God. And that's to do what I feel like doing, whereby the beliefs in my shoulds and shouldn'ts gets side benched. And whilst all the shoulds and shouldn'ts are benched, then I find, oh, in this moment I can do a whole range of other things. But while the shoulds and shouldn'ts aren't benched, while the shoulds and shouldn'ts are deeply ingrained, the full range of other things that I'm free to do in each moment get overlooked. So there's a huge freedom in coming to feel our uncomfortableness, see that it's completely linked to the belief that I'm the doer and I need to make life look a certain way, and the belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes. And the more we see this, the more we start functioning from a different place, the more we notice a snowballing of understanding. Because our experience changes, and when our experience changes, that feeds back as new conditioning, and the old beliefs get seen to be very limited, especially if our experience changes for the better, as we let go of old beliefs, as we let go of shoulds and shouldn'ts, and we find that our experience changes for the better. That experience for the better becomes new conditioning that allows us to let go of shoulds and shouldn'ts even more quickly, with even more confidence and faith. In fact, it's not really faith, because we're getting our own feedback. And then we start to feel more and more connected. We start to be able to follow these instructions that I'm speaking about, instructions that are delivered in the body. And then we find that our life becomes very consistent, as we could say, consistently. I now only know how to follow instruction based on what I feel to do. And at first, if someone's hearing it, or if we hear that, we might think, my goodness, if I live my life doing what I feel like doing, I'm going to become an irresponsible member of society. I'm going to become inefficient. I'm going to spend my life sleeping. But actually, this feeling, especially once the pent-up energies come out, which they do once we let go of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, they have scope all this energy that is kept in place with that misunderstanding come out. When that comes out, we start to see that this intelligence, this instruction I get given from God, this instruction from God from a new place, has me doing everything that I need to do. But now I do it because I feel like doing it. And so I find that I still feel like doing the dishes. I still feel like doing the shopping. I still feel like doing the laundry. I still feel like helping my friends. I still feel like turning up for satsang at the time that satsang is set. But I find that I don't have to set an agenda. I just need to allow the body to function. And in a situation when I find the body is telling me don't turn up for satsang, then what I find is that what I feel is usually also to give an explanation to people, so as I don't just leave people hanging. But I'm not afraid to say, wow, the feeling is telling me don't turn up to satsang, but give an explanation. And then I find that from that place, life still works out very well. It's much, much better than it did before, funnily enough. So the doer that used to think it was needed in order to control life, in order for life to remain on tracks, experientially gets recognized as being completely superfluous to the smooth functioning of life. And not only superfluous, but is an inhibitor to often the smooth functioning of life, and definitely an inhibitor to our peace of mind. So then we find we can consistently live life from that place. And I would say that for myself, for the last 20 years, I've been functioning from a place of doing in each moment what I feel like doing, finding that I'm not an irresponsible member of society, my life is not chaotic, and yet consistently functioning from that place. When it comes time to die, I know that life has been happy and peaceful, and I can die peacefully knowing that I've lived my life in each moment doing exactly what I feel like doing. The outcome, not in my control. Sometimes after doing what I feel like doing, the outcome is not positive. But the solace is I did what I felt like. I consistently do what I feel like, and so I'll live with the fact that sometimes the outcome is not pleasurable.
Yeah, and I realized another thing for me was originally not having that felt sense, or maybe not trusting that felt sense of what I feel like doing. And then the white and the black thinking would come in of originally when this first started happening, which was several months ago when I first heard your teachings. And when it first started happening, it was sort of the white or black approach of, well, I don't want to see anyone for 5 days, so I won't. With maybe no explanations, for instance. And then after a few weeks of like navigating it a little bit more, it was seen like there can be more creative approaches rather than what my mind might scream in an instant. Like if there were times if I kept going to parties or events that I didn't want to go to, then there would be a stopping of that and then not telling people that I wasn't going to go, not apologizing, but not even saying I wasn't going to go. And then eventually it was kind of like coming back to that middle road approach, so I might have swung too much in my own favor and then kind of came back to consider the other person, which I know that we've talked about before, but I think in the beginning that was something that seemed so daunting about do what you feel like doing, of, oh, if I do what I feel like doing, who knows what's going to happen. But the more that's sort of played with throughout life, I find there's like a natural balancing that just happens more.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, that swinging to the other side is sort of needed to break the beliefs in a way. We realize that we've spent our life maybe doing everything we thought was good for us, but in fact it's doing everything the other wanted, thinking it's good for us. And when we realize this is not good for, this is actually my unhappiness, then there can be a rebellion that says, never again. I'm only going to do what I want. And that's when we swing, which is needed. I'm not trying to correct that prematurely. We needed to do that, to break the habit of doing what the other wants us to do, although it's actually at that point in time it's what we want to do, because we think that doing what the other wants us to do is my happiness. So technically then it was doing what we want. And then we realize, no, this isn't the strategy that works. And then it's like, well, stuff the other. It's all about me. And actually that's an improvement. But then we also realize that that's an overreaction coming from this built up uncomfortableness from all these years of and once that's released, then this sort of comes back into the middle, and you find yourself able to explain yourself and still do what you feel like doing. So still you might not go out to the party, but you could find you do it in a way that is considerate of the other and doesn't maybe cause the same waves that were being caused when you swung a little bit far to the other side.
And honestly, for me, like one of the things that's most surprising of that movement is to see how unexpectedly life turns out to be once we start moving in that direction. Because the fear sometimes that's based on the story we tell ourselves of what that means, that movement, what it's going to mean, like how will the others react, or how will my life look once I start moving in the direction of what I want. It's massive. And once you start seeing that, actually, surprisingly enough, many times, like a very different outcome to what you thought would happens. Mm-hmm. It's amazing.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I do want to tell a little story now that we're talking, and we'll end it on this. The do what you feel like doing. It remember, it's do what you think or feel like doing. So that is a description, and it actually is a description of how everyone in life is always functioning, because it includes do what you think or feel. So it's not a prescription, it's just a description of how everyone is functioning, because those people that are functioning from their shoulds and shouldn'ts are doing what they think they should do. Right? So they're doing what they think or feel. In this case, think. And that's where it's then important for us to see. So this isn't a should, this isn't saying you should do what you feel. It's a description that says if you do what you think you should and shouldn't do, it delivers an uncomfortableness. So that's a description. And if you do what you feel by dropping below the deeply ingrained shoulds and shouldn'ts, it starts to deliver a freedom. So that's a description. And if someone tests it out for themselves, then they'll find that the movement towards doing what we feel like doing gets stronger from our own experience. And so once again, it ends up being a description of what might happen, not something that you orchestrate. The description is given, it becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. We start functioning that way. The outcomes are seen to be positive or negative. If they turn out to be positive beyond our what we imagined, then that starts influencing how we function in the next moment, more and more feeling maybe. So, and it ties in that both doing what we think we should do is our instruction from God at a particular point in time, and doing what we feel like doing is also our instruction from God. It's just that one instruction drives us down a path where we feel uncomfortable, believing we're the doer, and the other where we feel spontaneous and free. Now, often we might think, when I'm doing what I feel like, I'm following instruction from God, but when I'm doing what I think I should or shouldn't, then I'm not taking instruction from God, and I'm leading the show. But the fact is, there is no doer. So even when we're functioning from our shoulds and shouldn'ts, that's just how the story of life has unfolded. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts are there because of our up-to-date conditioning. And our up-to-date conditioning that life put in place, not we put in place, includes this attachment to outcomes, which is then solidified the shoulds and shouldn'ts. New conditioning comes in, says, hey, try it differently. Puts an explanation onto why the shoulds and shouldn'ts are there, why they're not going to actually deliver us what we're really looking for. And so then life might change and we start feeling this different place of moving from. So at some point when this became apparent for me, that I was not honoring what the body was instructing as fully as I could. And I started to realize, after it had become clear, that what I'm really looking for is the end of internal conflict. And the internal conflict, to me, at the time, those were the words, internal conflict. Now, that equates to attitude, an attitude of resistance. And at the time, this internal conflict was arising because the body would be tired and I would have an appointment to go out in the evening. And so the two were fighting each other, and then my attitude was of fighting the situation, attitudinally. I don't want to go out, but I have to go out. Why did I make plans to go out? All of that was the internal conflict. And when it became clear that in order for this internal conflict to stop, I either had to accept that my preferences weren't being delivered, but in a lot of cases I could see, well, my preferences aren't being delivered because of where you're making your decisions from. And I thought, a lot of your preferences are very easily met by simply functioning and making decisions based on a different set of ideals in life. So then the shoulds and shouldn'ts went out the window, and I said to myself, don't make plans based on you should make plans because that's how you'll make good friends and that's where your love will come from and that's where your happiness is. Don't make plans if you find that making plans means you end up with an internal conflict at the time of the plan about to eventuate, because on one level you're tired and on the other level you have a plan. So it was very simple. Stop making plans and start being more spontaneous. Make a decision in each moment based on how you feel. And at first that was a bit hard because, we don't tend to live life like that. And sometimes we'd get asked a very reasonable question, would you like to come out for dinner on Friday night? And then from this place, it's like, well, if I'm going to honor what I've decided I'm going to start doing, which is making spontaneous decisions, I have to tell the person, well, I'm sorry, I don't know. And the person might think, what do you mean you don't know? So I can't feel like what I feel like doing because it's too far out. And a lot of people won't appreciate that, won't understand it, will take it personally. And so when we get that sort of feedback, and people start thinking this person's a bit strange, then it's a bit of a challenge to us honoring this, because we might think, no, it's easier to just go back to the way I used to live life. But if we don't do that and we realize that I need to this is a new way that I need to foster, I need to cultivate. If we don't and we stick with it, then what we start finding is that this internal conflict starts falling away. And so as I found this more and more, there was this movement to feeling, and it was a wonderful new discovery that I can make decisions from this place of feeling. And so at some point, and you'll see why this is not necessarily for everyone, but at some point, and because it was a fairly major decision, there was a lot of this process of feeling that came in before this point, where I'd say, I really have to, in each moment, do what I feel like doing. And it became very clear, I don't feel like going into work often at all. I really don't feel like it. And I looked at my circumstance, and I found that if I don't go into work, then I'm going to lose my job. If I lose my job, I'm going to lose my income. If I'm going to lose my income, I can't pay my bills. I looked at my circumstance really closely, because I said, I can't just do what I feel like without also giving consideration to the consequences. But let me look at the situation more open-mindedly. And I thought, if I don't have an income, because I've now not gone into work and lost my job, can I survive? Can I find alternative work that I do like? Can I find alternative living arrangements? Could I go and live back at home, where I maybe don't have to pay rent or food, depending on your parents' circumstances, depending on whether they will accept you back home, which they might not. Now, that wasn't an option for me, or wasn't something that was particularly interesting as a solution, but I did always find I had a fascination with living in nature, and I had been seeing pictures of nature for years and feeling like I really resonated with it. So I decided, well, I'm going to go and live in the forest. I'm going to live in a caravan, and I'm going to grow my own food. I had all sorts of ideas that maybe wouldn't have worked out, but I thought about it and really imagined myself in the situation as fully as I could, waking up in the morning with nothing to do. And then I thought, that sounds great. There is a social security system in Australia that I was entitled to if I didn't have a job. And I thought, well, that's going to be enough for me to buy my food. So even if the plants didn't grow, I would still have money to buy my food. And so after thinking about it for 2 or 3 months, and getting to the stage where I borrowed a trailer, a caravan, I put a mattress in it, bought all of my knives and forks and spoons and plates, blankets and pillows and everything that I actually really needed, water containers. So the thing was fully ready to go. And so one morning I said, this is it. The next night, actually it was in the night, I said, I unplugged my alarm clock. The day I threw my alarm clock away. I unplugged it, saying, okay, tomorrow I'm going to wake up when I wake up, and I'm going to do what I feel like. And so I woke up within 5 minutes of when I normally wake up, even without the alarm clock. So I was still technically in time to get ready to go for work, but I felt I don't feel like getting up to go to work. So I lay in bed a bit longer, and at some point I felt like getting out of bed, but I didn't feel like going to work. So I stayed on the couch. I started reading a book. I didn't tell anyone I wasn't going into work, which, but that's what I felt like doing. And then there was this night system at work where we could enter things on the computer system after hours. And this was back in 2002. So the internet wasn't anywhere near developed where it is now. And I diverted my phone from work to my mobile, and I found that I was able to deal with some clients from home, receiving calls on my mobile and using this fairly rudimentary order entry system. And so a lot of clients I had fell to the side, and some clients I kept dealing with, but I was dealing with them from home, not going into work. And after about 5 weeks, I needed to get something from work, so I went into work, went up to my desk quietly, and a couple of friends started talking to me. Where have you been? Blah, blah, blah. Then my boss came past, and he said, Roger, where have you been? And I said, I've been working from home. And he said, oh, all right, carry on, and left. I thought that was easy. And so what had happened is that I was still dealing with clients sufficiently that I was meeting my minimum requirements for work. And so what I thought where I was going to lose my job didn't actually end up happening. I didn't end up losing my, but I found myself working in a very different way to what was unacceptable to me prior to that. It turns out that my business actually got much stronger dealing with this type of clients instead of the type of clients I was dealing with. And so for the next 8 years, I essentially worked from home with a business that was stronger than what it was before. Took some time to build up, but it built up to something much more robust. And so the moral of the story is that life works in mysterious ways. What I expected to happen didn't happen. If I had lost my job, which, anyone listening, it's a real possibility. If you don't go into work, it's a very big possibility you lose your job. Who knows what might have happened from there, especially if you give it some considered thought, what other options are available to you. So my suggestion here is not for everyone to become completely irresponsible, but rather maybe to show that this way of functioning can be introduced slowly at first for small decisions. That's how it happened for me, those things that we feel comfortable with changing. And as we start to see the results of doing what I feel like instead of what I should and shouldn't, based on this idea that that's my happiness, that's how I have to live life. As we start changing little things, we might find ourselves with more and more courage to change bigger and bigger things until eventually, in my case, I unplugged my alarm clock and decided not to go into work. It wasn't that brave because actually the outcome of losing my job wasn't such a bad outcome anymore because I had considered living in the forest and I was looking forward to it. It's like, actually, this is not a downgrade. This is great. It didn't happen until at some point I decided to move into the forest, but in a house in the forest. So I ended up living in the forest. Here we are. So